for the next half an hour or so as we look a little bit more at Will's life in school and at home. And the one thing that I've loved doing with these talks and looking for is where these life experiences crop up in the plays, because I'm a firm believer that anything that anything that you go through as a person in life, it makes you the person you are. It colours who you are. And that's, although we have so little evidence about who Will actually was, what he thought, what he felt, that wealth of work that he left us has got to reflect some part of his life. So it's been fascinating trying to match up bits of his life, the experiences he would have had, to the places where they turn up in the plays. And that's something that we'll continue to do tonight. So, like I say, if you have any questions, I just saw Chris Porter's comment there of lifting chocolate into his mouth. Yeah, I'm sure you could, maybe an Easter rabbit, a limp bunny, lifting that's fine. We can go with that. Lovely to have you along, Chris. So here we go tonight. His education. For the first 6 to 12 months of Will's life, he would have been wrapped in swaddling bands because it was considered unhealthy for children to have free use of their arms and legs. Between the years 1 and 3, he would have been moved into a russet dress. So visitors to Henley Street wouldn't have known whether he was a little boy or a little girl. In fact, all children up until about they were 3 or 4 were dressed in dresses. But at some point, around about 3 or 4, and at the discretion of his parents, Mary and John, he would have been breeched. Now, that probably sounds like has another sort of connotation to it, but breeching meant that he actually got given his first pair of breeches, his first pair of trousers. And it sounds a little bit glib, but actually it was a really important moment, a little bit like your 21st or your 16th birthday, for a little boy's life to suddenly be given these manly trousers. And there would have been a celebration in the house on his breeching day. And perhaps it's something that stuck with him because in one of his early plays, the third part of Henry VI, he references that act, and I can read you a little bit from it. This is a part where the Yorkists, so that's who will become Richard III and Edward IV, have captured Prince Edward, who is Henry VI's son, the Lancastrian line, and they're taunting him a little bit. And he stands up for himself and he says, "Suppose that I am now my father's mouth. Resign thy chair," he says to Edward IV, "and where I stand, kneel thou, whilst I propose the self-same words to thee, which, traitor, thou wouldst have me answer to." The Queen Margaret, says, "Ah, that thy father had been so resolved." To which Richard of Gloucester, Richard III later, says, "Oh, that you might have worn the petticoat and ne'er have stolen the breech from Lancaster." To which Edward replies, "Let Aesop fable in a winter's night. His currish riddle sought not with this place." To which Richard says, "By heaven, brat, I'll plague thee for that word." Note there are a couple of references to the petticoats and the breeches, but also Aesop's fables. That we'll come back to Aesop's fables, something that Will probably would have done very early on in school. Now, remember that Elizabethan England was predominantly an oral culture. People still relied on word of mouth. A word was your bond. And perhaps more importantly for our young Will, at his age, people also still told stories and shared stories, like any family, and they were at the heart of this child's and any child's early years at home. Last week, we spoke about a key time very early on in Will's life, which he spent with his mother, those first 30 years. He was an only child for 2.5 years, and before his brother Gilbert came along. And indeed, that first year, he survived 3 months of plague visiting Stratford. So that sense of that closeness of his mother to the son, would have had a major impact on his education in these very, very early days. We also spoke last week about how Mary could trace her line back, her ancestry, to the days of the old Ardens, to Simon de Montfort in the 13th century, whose brother-in-law was Henry III, who had granted de Montfort custody of the nearby Grand Castle Kenilworth, only 14 miles from Stratford. And the siege of Kenilworth in 1266 was a massive moment in Plantagenet history, but also it was one of the longest and the most infamous in English history. And surely such things would feature not only in local stories, but wow, if your mum had ancestors who might have been involved with that, surely those kinds of stories, would have been told around the hearth in Henley Street. Mary's uncle also attended court of Henry VII at the beginning of the 1500s. So all sorts of interesting, anecdotal stories of families would have been flying around Henley Street, I'm sure, on dark winter evenings. Another key place for stories was church, and it's a key part again of any Elizabethan's education. Stories from the Bible are littered throughout his work. The historian A.L. Rouse wrote a fascinating book called Shakespeare the Man, and in it he observes that Will's works have more references in the Bible than any of Christopher Marlowe's do, or George Peele's. The story of Cain and Abel turns up some 25 times. It's referenced or indirectly referenced, and Rouse goes on in his book to note that numerous phrasings in the plays have their roots in the readings that Shakespeare would have experienced on Sundays in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford, from things like the Book of Psalms or the Commandments or the Bishop's Bible, the latest edition of the Bible that had been published just before Will was born. In Henry VI, Part 1, Falstaff says to Falstaff says to Bardolph, "Do thou amend thy face, and I'll amend my life," which Rouse notes comes from the morning and evening prayers. It also comes from the communion prayer. So there's some direct references that Shakespeare is using from Bibles. Now, whether that's something that he read later as an older person, or whether it's something that stuck with him every day, every Sunday as a child, who knows? Domestically as well, there would have been the stories of Warwickshire folklore. St. Wulfstan, the great miracle worker, is said to have been born in Warwickshire, and there's a window dedicated to him in the church in Snitterfield, where the Shakespeares had land, where the Ardens had land, and Shakespeare's dad was leasing land from the Ardens in Snitterfield at that time. St. George, famous St. George and the Dragon, was reputedly born and died in Coventry, again, only a few miles up the road from Stratford. Then you couple all of those things with the folkloric legends of things like the Green Man and Robin Hood and Robin Goodfellow, who appears in Midsummer Night's Dream, and you can begin to see how easily the head of a fertile imagination can absorb all of these stimuli around him. Childhood, as we know it today, it wouldn't have been quite the same as in Will's time. Children grew up probably a lot faster, but you went to school a bit later. So around about 7 or 8 is when you would have been going to school, and you would have been there for about 6 or 7 years, and then you would have either been gone on to further schools or education, or to university, or you would have left to take up a trade if you had been lucky enough to go to a secondary school, if you like, in that sense. Petty schools were in existence, and they were sort of informal schools, and they were the sorts of things that an older lady may run in her house, at the back of her house, for very small children, learning stories, learning them to read. it would be very similar to like an infant school from that point of view. But grammar schools, and we'll come on to school in a little bit later, were very different. But probably one of the biggest ways Will learn was probably like all children, was through playing. So I thought it'd be quite fun to have a little look at some of the games and the sports that young Will, as a 7 or 8 year old, as a 12-year-old, may have got involved with. And some of them are not a million miles away from what we still play today. Tag, Piggy in the Middle, Sardines, Blind Man's Buff, all of those sorts of games were still, were being played in Shakespeare's day, along with having marbles, skittles, spinning tops, all of that sort of stuff. Couple of ones which sounded quite interesting, I thought I'd share with you. I found one was called Barley Break. This is for 6 people in 3 couples, and you line up 10 feet apart. So the couples line up opposite each other, and then one couple at the end shouts barley, and then the other couple at the end shout break, and then you all have to run and try and swap places, without the couple in the middle trying to catch them. So a little bit like sort of British Bulldog, I seem to remember, in the playground. And if you're caught, then you end up having to switch places with their counterpart in the middle group. So again, a little bit like British Bulldog, but it was a really it was a cunning way for men and women, boys and girls, to be able to have a little bit of flirtation and a little bit of physical intimacy with people, because you weren't allowed to do that in polite society or in public. But here you were playing a game, you means you could actually grab hold of maybe somebody you fancied, or and find a bit of a catch, or so. Maybe that's where you first met your true love. Who knows? But one of the sports that seemed, or one of the pastimes that seems to have caused as much consternation and passion as it does today is football. Now, in 1542, Henry VIII actually banned football, along with bowls, dice, cards, a game called Shove Groat, which is a little bit like Shove Halfpenny, because he wanted everybody all the working men to be focusing on their archery skills. But football is incredibly popular. In fact, it's first mentioned in 1314, and it's played in the street. There don't seem to be any rules attached to it. By the time we get to around about Will's age, in the 1560s, it's moved on from being an inflated pig's bladder to being actually something encased in leather and filled possibly with dried peas. And it's kind of a little bit like rugby, in the sense that or maybe Australian rules football, in the sense you could pick it up, you could kick it, you could run with it. And there was no sort of obvious goalpost on a pitch or anything like that. You just sort of kicked it along the street. And it seems that anybody can join in with it. There was no sort of, you've got more players, I've got less players. But it was incredibly violent. This is an account of a game of football by a commentator at the time, not a football commentator, called Philip Stubbs. And he says, it may rather be called a friendly kind of fight than play or recreation, a bloody murdering practice than a fellowly sport or pastime. In fact, it was... there were accounts of goalkeepers being killed during these games. And Shakespeare mentions it a couple of times in such a context. In King Lear, Kent calls the conniving servant Oswald, a base football player. And in the Comedy of Errors, the twin servant Dromio complains of his treatment by his masters when he says, "Am I so round with you as you with me, that like a football you do spurn me thus? You spurn me hence, and he will spurn me hither. If I last in this service, you must case me in leather." The Birthplace Trust on their website, the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust on their website, observes that more people died playing football in Elizabethan times and then by sword or by fighting or wrestling. But it wasn't the only violent recreational sport that Will may have got involved with. They really did like a rough and tumble. There was one game which is called Box About. Now, it's probably the least violent, but probably the most banal game you could ever. And the rules are incredibly simple. You're in a group of people, let's say you're in a circle. One person takes it upon themselves to punch the person next to them as hard as they possibly can, declaring, "Box about!" Then that person then has to try and punch someone else. Once you've been punched, you've got to try and punch the next person. The idea is not to be punched, but you can't punch the person who first started punch about. And the last person obviously can't punch anybody, and you're declared as the winner. It's a bit of a strange game. I don't know how popular it was, but there we go, box about. Another one is Done is the Mayor. Now, this was where two people found the largest, wettest logs they could find, and they would drop them, they would take turns in dropping them on each other's feet. Part of that, and the first person to say, "Oh no, I've had enough," is the loser. But in Romeo and Juliet, Mercutio actually has a little bit of a reference to this. He says, so when he's trying to get Romeo to come to the Capulet's ball with him, he says, "Tut, done's the mouse. The constable's own word, if thou art done, will draw thee from the mire of this Sir Reverence love, wherein thou stickest up to the ears." So which kind of physicalizes Romeo's inaction, but also references the mire, the mare, draw thee from the mire, done's the mouse, done is the mare. You can see how these things are being elided together. And Mercutio keeps going in the scene, keeps putting these heavy logs, if you like, upon Romeo until he gives in and goes along with him to the ball. But not all games were violent. There would have been dice, there would have been cards, there would have been shove-groat, as I say, and the Nine Men's Morris. Now, Nine Men's Morris was a board game, and it was it actually has its roots in Roman history, but it was a little bit like chess, a little bit like drafts. It was a sort of strategy game. It was played on a wooden board with counters, but there's a story that there's accounts that in Warwickshire, shepherds and boys who worked in the fields would dig up turf to make the board and then use large wooden counters. These were the men. You had 9 of them, so 9 men's, and you played it outdoors in the fields, which of course actually was really useless when it's throwing it down with rain in the winter months, as Titania in A Midsummer Night's Dream explains. The Nine Men's Morris is filled up with mud, and the quaint mazes in the wanton green for lack of tread are indistinguishable. Maybe Shakespeare saw shepherds playing it in the fields. Who knows? But out and about, with all these games and sports, children could roam freely and far and wide through gardens, through the backs of fields, without the reproach from their parents. But at home, it was a very different matter. Courtesy and gentility were the watchwords of Elizabethan society. And remember, like we said last week, the Shakespeares are at the centre of civic life. Dad is a rising star in the local council and the corporation. He will become the mayor. So how they behaved and how they showed themselves and acknowledged their neighbours would be of paramount importance. And so their children would also be schooled, if you like, in the same way. Now, there are many books written at the time about how to behave, what are polite manners. And one volume published in 1577 was called The Book of Nurture or School for Good Manners. And the chap who wrote it, Hugh Rhodes, gives a really perceptive insight into the types of upbringing that Will may well have had at this time. So there would have been general rules, included things like, let me give you an example. Don't tell secrets to strangers. Don't meddle in other men's affairs. Rebuke men only when you are alone with them. Be courteous to strangers. don't trust people you don't know, or fairly straightforward. But then think about Polonius's advice to Laertes in Hamlet when he's about to go off to university, back to Wittenberg. Polonius says, "Give thy thoughts no tongue, nor any unproportioned thought his act. Be thou familiar, but by no means vulgar. Beware of entrance to a quarrel, but being in, bear it that the opposed may beware of thee. Give every man thy ear, but few thy voice. Take each man's censure, but reserve thy judgment." They're pretty much the same. Hugh Rhodes' book goes on at length as well, though, to include table manners, which I think is really interesting for Elizabethans. So you've got stuff, very obvious stuff in here, like wash your hands before you eat. Don't slurp your soup. Keep your knife bright. Eat only small morsels of meat. Wipe your mouth after each time you have drunk from a cup. Now, you might say those are all fairly normal, fairly well to be expected, but it also has some interesting advice for table manners as well, which gives us a little bit of a window into what else, what could be going on at the dinner table in Elizabethan England. Don't scratch your head at the table, or put your finger in your mouth, or break wind. If you have to spit or blow your nose, don't leave it on the ground. Tread it in, or out of sight. Don't share food with someone else if you have putrefied teeth. Don't belch in another man's face. It says nothing about belching in a woman's face, so whether that was acceptable or not, who knows. But in Twelfth Night, Sir Toby has clearly never read this book. His niece says to him, he's only fit for the mountains and the barbarous caves where manners ne'er were preached, which perhaps she has a point, because a few moments earlier he has belched in her face from a portion of pickled herring. But we can perhaps assume that Shakespeare, given his eloquent and elegant expression, perhaps was an exponent of courtesy and of manners, maybe the pink of courtesy, as Mercutio says that he is in Romeo and Juliet. The historian Park Honan, I mentioned him last week in his book Shakespeare Alive, observes that in Shakespeare's tragic plays, the central characters' downfalls are not necessarily charged through aggression or violence, but actually also through inappropriate conduct or through unsuitable language. Richard II, Richard III, Bolingbroke, Othello, Hamlet, Lear, they all lose their grip on the real world and they fall into an imagined world where courtesy and decorum hold no sway. In fact, courtesy is used by Shakespeare 71 times through his plays. And what may have been his first play, The Two Gentlemen of Verona, there's a set of outlaws, and they're possibly the most polite outlaws you'll ever meet. And although they kidnap Valentine and his servant Speed towards the end, they still demonstrate some kind of restrained decorum. They say, "But if thou scorn our courtesy, thou diest." So that was kind of life at home for the 7-year-old Shakespeare, and those kind of schoolings would have continued throughout his life. But let's see what happens now at the age of 7 or 8. He's going to leave his mother's side of hearing those old stories of Warwickshire, and he's about to enter the world of Greek and Roman plays, comedies, Latin. We're about to explode into grammar school. Now, his dad's place on the Stratford Council meant that Will could attend the King's New School, as it was then called, on Church Street. The building was part of the Guildhall where his father worked. It had been built in 1420, so it's 600 years old this year. And it was given its royal seal by Edward VI, Henry VIII's son, in 1553, just 1 year after Guildford's grammar school was given its charter by Edward VI. Now, the school didn't charge fees, But all the children who went were expected to bring their own firewood and their own candles to write by. Now, Latin and Greek, as I say, were the bedrock of schooling at that time, and learning was exercised through verbal repetition, verbal debate, and verbal argument. So not necessarily writing as such, because to be able to stand up and present your argument or to debate an issue coherently was a sign of intellect and maturity. So even in a sense, his education was in part a performance, and that's why you get, many. You have, there's a tradition within the law community that they stage their own plays and amateur plays, and some, because the element of putting a story together, an argument together, the thing that enwraps us about a law, about a trial on television, is the storytelling, but the theatricality is about how you present your argument. And if you look at some of the greatest scenes and speeches in Shakespeare, they are just a long argument. Antony's friends, Romans, countrymen, Henry V upon the king, Macbeth, if it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well, it were done quickly. And of course, the most famous argument, debate in Shakespeare is Hamlet's on suicide, to be or not to be. School. So he's there, he's at school, but what time does he get there? Well, he has to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning because school starts at 6. His first break came at around about 11 o'clock, and if you were in the playground, you had to speak Latin. You were not allowed at school. You weren't really allowed to speak anything else other than Latin, which is quite something. Learning then continued from 1 o'clock through till about 5:30. Prayers were taken 3 times a day, and school met 6 days a week. You had Sundays off. There's about 42 in the school, and they would be split into upper and lower school. The master would take the upper school, the usher, as they know, would take the lower school. The master at Stratford was famously paid £20 a year, which then was actually more than the master at Eton. Much of the teaching, as I say, was in Latin, and indeed the boys were taught nothing about modern history, about geography, about politics. I mean, geography, perhaps that's where, some of Shakespeare's slightly more dodgy, shall we say, geographical elements come into it. Bohemia having a coastline, for example. In Two Gentlemen of Verona, they go by boat by sea from Verona to Milan, which would be a long way around Italy. But every Friday, the week's lessons had to be known by heart, or perfectly, as the record says. And so Will would have been memorizing Latin on a daily basis. In The Merry Wives of Windsor, there's a very famous scene which is quite often cut because it doesn't necessarily lend anything to the plot. But it's a moment where Hugh Evans, the Welsh pastor, is teaching the page's son, William, Latin. And perhaps it's a little snapshot of Will's own experience at school. It goes with this. So it starts with Hugh Evans. He says, "What is lapis, William?" "A stone." "And what is a stone, William?" "A pebble." "No, it is lapis. I pray you, remember in your praying." "Oh, lapis. That is good, William." And he goes on. It's a long scene between the two of them about the cases, the grammatical cases in Latin. And he finishes with saying to his mother, Hugh says to his mother, he has a good sprag memory, a smart memory. Perhaps just a little bit of autobiographical stuff there from Shakespeare, maybe. But at lower school, where this character would have been, this young William, Will probably would have started reading with Aesop, or learning Aesop's fables, and the Renaissance poet Baptiste Mantuan. Now, Mantuan was he was a poet, Italian poet, about 100 or so years ago in Italy. But clearly, I think Shakespeare quite liked him, because Mantuan is mentioned a couple of times in Love's Labour's Lost. His works crop up twice, once in the song at the end, and Holofernes, the schoolmaster, sort of reminisces and says, "Ah, good old Mantuan, who understands thee not, loves thee not." And Holofernes actually is a fascinating expose, perhaps, on perhaps Will's school's teachers at the King's New School. He's incredibly verbose and almost unintelligible. The wonderful James Sheldon played him for us a couple of years ago in Our Love's Labour's Lost, with all the Latin that he espouses. He says of the braggart Don Armado, "Nov hominum tanquam te." His humour, his lofty, his discourse peremptory, his tongue filed, his eye ambitious, his gait majestical, and his general behaviour vain, ridiculous, and thrasonical. He is too picked, too spruce, too affected, too odd, as it were, too peregrinate, as I may call it. And of poor Constable Dull, the local constable, he says, "He hath never fed of the dainties that are bred in a book. He hath not eat paper, as it were. He hath not drunk ink. His intellect is not replenished. He is only an animal, only sensible in the duller parts." Now, whether that's Will having a little bit of a go at his Latin teachers, or whether it's a memory of his Latin teachers, who knows? But it's a fact. But for me, I like to think that it's some memory lodged in there from either Master Cottam or Master Jenkins, who was a Welshman actually, who taught at the school during Will's time. But they're fascinating windows into, I think, perhaps a little bit of a memory. So this learning, though, in Latin and Greek, clearly stayed with him, and because it turns up in every play. Sometimes either incorrectly to show a character's inadequacies, referenced incorrectly, or in his Roman and history plays to add weight and seriousness to the action, or whether it's something that, again, in Shakespeare's plays, he's playing to many people. He's got the groundlings, he's got the clerks and the court and lawyers, and then the gentlemen. So who all would have had a different element of learning themselves. So for them, some of those things could be popular references. So later in life, he's working on many levels, bringing perhaps some of this stuff that he would have remembered or learnt at school to bear to his audiences. Again, remember I said that we are in an oral culture predominantly. So the mastery, Elizabethans were fascinated by sound and word sounds and word play and the rhythms that they create. Now, I'm not suggesting that 12 or 14 Shakespeare was already a genius with with writing and the English language, but again, in that very early play, the Two Gentlemen of Verona, there's a wonderful exchange between Proteus and Speed. Speed is Valentine's servant, and Proteus is Valentine's friend. And Speed says to him, "The shepherd seeks the sheep, and not the sheep the shepherd. But I seek my master, and my master seeks not me. Therefore, I am no sheep." To which Proteus responds, "The sheep for fodder follows the shepherd. The shepherd for food follows the sheep. Thou for wages followest thy master. Thy master for wages follows not thee. Therefore thou art a sheep." To which Speed replies, "Such another proof will make me cry bah." So that sound, that sound of words, that fun, that speed, that eloquence of words, and economics of words, which is something that Shakespeare becomes famous for using, and making words his tools. If he's got to remember stuff every day, recited at the end of the week, you can see where a young person is starting to absorb that kind of skill. At upper school, when he would have progressed to being older, he would have moved on to read some of the more Roman classics, so Cicero, Erasmus, Terence, Horace, Virgil, and Ovid. Now, Ovid becomes, and his book Metamorphoses, becomes Shakespeare's passion. It was his favorite. It influences both his Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece, his two long narrative poems, but also Midsummer Night's Dream, Romeo and Juliet, The Tempest, Twelfth Night, and there's another two others, Coriolanus and Troilus and Cressida. Now, The Tempest, there's a moment in there where he lifts almost Ovid's words directly off the page into the mouth of Prospero. Prospero says, ye elves of hills, brooks, standing lakes and groves. Whilst Medea, in the 1567 translation of Metamorphoses, says, ye airs and winds, ye elves of hills, of brooks, of woods alone, of standing lakes. I mean, it's almost word for word. Both of them proclaim their dark power to be able to move trees and direct the winds. And so there's a real similarity between these two. So you can almost identify exactly where Shakespeare got this from. The Mechanicals play, Pyramus and Thisbe, is a direct parody of the forbidden love story of Pyramus and Thisbe in Book 4 of Metamorphoses. But it wasn't all book work as well. Elizabethan school children also had plays and acting. Acting was seen as a really important part of a boy's education. Again, it's about being able to have the confidence to stand up and put an argument together to state your claim on something. Dramas by Plautus and Seneca were comedies by Plautus, were part of the curriculum. Those comedies by Plautus would be the basis for Twelfth Night, for the Comedy of Errors. They would have acted in plays. Popular play at the time, 1567, Ralph Royster Doyster, which has got a great name, had patriotic songs in it and prayers for Queen Elizabeth. And if you put all those things together, you think, well, actually, if you're of a mind that wants to absorb all this, which let's say Shakespeare did, school must have been a really exciting place to go. There's a lovely scene in Henry IV Part 2 where two old scholars from Oxford meet and talk about their long lost school days, Justice Shallow and Justice Silent. And I'll read you a little bit of what Shallow says. He says, Silent says, "You were called lusty Shallow then, cousin." To which Shallow says, "By the mass, I was called anything. I would have done anything, indeed, too. And roundly, too. There I was, and little John Doit of Staffordshire, and Black George Barnes, and Francis Pickbone, and Will Squeal, a Cotswold man. You had not four such swingebucklers in all the Inns of Court again. And I may say to you, we knew where the Bonarobas were," that's the attractive horse, "and had the best of them at all commandment. Then was Jack Falstaff, now Sir John. I see him break Scoggan's head at the court gate, where now was a crack not thus high. And the very same day did I fight with one Samson Stockfish, a fruiterer. Jeez you, the mad days I have spent." Maybe not Shakespeare's own life story, but certainly some first-hand voices in there somewhere, I reckon. Will's plan for his parents was probably that he would have become a clerk, or maybe a lawyer, maybe the clergy, or a teacher. But certainly, a schooling at this level would have enabled him to go into those kinds of professions. In 1579, the schoolmaster at the new school in Stratford is asked by the Bishop of Worcester to recommend boys who were forward of learning for advancement. Now, at this point, Will would have been 14 or 15 and would have been in that perfect area to have been, promoted, if you like. But things were going badly, as we said last week at this point, for John and his family. Throughout the 1570s, John is being regularly fined. He's being accused of missing payments. He disappears from public life. And so by 1580, he's no longer on the council, which would have lost him his status, but also quite possibly would have come the loss of Will's education at the grammar school. A.L. Rowson, I mentioned earlier, he makes an observation in his book that many of the references and metamorphoses are from book 1, and also the first book of the Old Testament, from the first gospel. And he argues, could you take that as a sign that actually he didn't progress further in his studies and he left school before he progressed to the other books? I mean, I don't know, that's just one idea. In fact, the truth is, we have no evidence for whether Shakespeare went to school or not, because there are no registers, there's no logbooks, there's no school reports to say that he ever went there. We can only suggest that he did because of his father's standing and what is contained in his plays. So there's much in our story, and one of supposition and piecing together the evidence that is there. Ben Jonson, in his eulogy to Shakespeare at the front of the first folio, says that he had small Latin and little Greek, and less Greek, which may seem a bit of a dig at Shakespeare, but then it comes in the same sentence as him also saying, I would not seek for names, but call forth thundering Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sophocles to us, Pacuvius, Accius, him of Cordova dead, to life again, to hear thy buskin tread and shake a stage. Or when thy socks were on, leave thee alone for the comparison of all that insolent Greece or haughty Rome. Shakespeare had to learn it somewhere, surely. For someone who became so popular and so famous in this art form during his own lifetime, as Ben Jonson there admits, we've only got to look at our own lives to see where our dreams and our ambitions are forged. And it's where stories, phrases, characters are held they become part of our own oral, our mental and physical life story, our own history. For me, the fascination with acting and theatre came when I watched things like Indiana Jones and I wanted to be Marty McFly in Back to the Future. I had no idea how I would get there. And Kirkstone Drive in Worcester felt like, a million miles away from such a fantasy. I read the Hardy Boys and Choose Your Own Adventure novels, and those sorts of make up your own story things lodged in my brain. Later, I came through watching the BBC television series, the adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, and the film Amadeus. And then I wanted to relive those periods of history. And then when I discovered Shakespeare, it was actually, to begin with, it was the incredible titles of these plays, these gloriously mysterious titles. All's Well That Ends Well, The Merchant of Venice. That sparked my fascination and, more importantly, my imagination. And I like to think that, not too dissimilar a route could be attributed to Shakespeare and his journey of the imagination through his classical books, his lands, his ideas of Medea, of Ganymede, of Euripides, Cain and Abel, Robin Hood, Pyramus and Thisbe, King Arthur, Robin Goodfellow. And next week, we will learn about where he may have seen some of those stories played out, where he may have had those moments of seeing those characters that he was learning about and hearing about, either from fireside stories or in church, in the Bible stories, or at school, where he actually saw them physicalized on stage. So next week, we're going to look at the entertainments that Shakespeare would have had access to in Stratford as a boy. We're going to look at the pageants. We're going to look at the plays he would have seen and some of those visiting players that would have come to Stratford and beyond. Folks, I've once again thoroughly enjoyed my evening with you. If you have any questions, please, you can email them into guildford-shakespeare-company.co.uk. The email is on our website. And next week we will be looking at Shakespeare's entertainment. Thank you once again. I hope that you've all enjoyed this evening, learned a little something, and maybe make you go off and read something else about Shakespeare's life. Once again, please stay home, stay safe, and we will see you all next week. Take care of yourselves, folks, and keep looking at the At Home with GSC stuff for all those extra bits and pieces that we're putting out once a day, every day. Have a look on our homepage on the website and see what we've got to offer tomorrow. Podcast tomorrow with Philip de Orleans, stage fighting director extraordinaire. Take care, folks, and good night. Bye-bye.